You're listening to a 3CR podcast created in the studios of independent community radio station 3CR in Melbourne, Australia. For more information, go to allthews.3cr.org.au.
3CR is about community, and we welcome your participation at the station.
3CR is open to a wide diversity of volunteers and is a great way to connect with Melbourne's activist community.
Have you ever thought about volunteering, doing a reception shift, getting a program on air?
Training in radio skills or contributing to one of the station's committees.
There are many ways to be involved at 3CR.
To find out more, go to 3cr.org.au and get in touch.
That plot destruction, sorcerer of death's construction, in the fields of bodies burning, as the war machine keeps turning, death and hatred to mankind, poisoning their brainwashed mind.
Welcome to the Anarchist World This Week, broadcast across Australia on the National Community Radio Satellite. Listen to the Anarchist World This Week, Australia's sacred cow slaughterhouse. Listen to analysis of local, national, international events. Listen to analysis you'll never hear anywhere else. Welcome to the Anarchist World This Week, broadcast across Australia, courtesy of the Community Radio Network. My name's Joseph Toscano. This program is coming to you from the studios of 3CR in Melbourne, 855 on your AM dial. If you wonder what anarchism is all about, no, it's not about the chaos around the place. Anarchism comes from the word, or anarchy from the words anarchos, which means without rulers. So the anarchist struggle is the struggle to create a society without rulers. Not without rules, but without rulers. It's based on two principles: the devolution of power, possibly through direct democratic means, and the holding of wealth in common. Simple concepts which people have been struggling for thousands of years, but difficult to implement. Let's not forget that, difficult to implement. As long as we go on the private investment for private profit treadmill, hoping somehow we'll win Tats Lotto and our lives will change, well, it's not like that. Life changed through struggle. And if there's one thing we need to remember, if you listen to the Anarchist World This Week, every single privilege you enjoy today in this country, and it bores me every time people say we live in the best country in the universe, the known world, every single thing you take for granted, like a universal health scheme, Medicare, a universal pharmaceutical scheme, public education, public hospitals, public infrastructure, the variety of social security supports which are available to 1/3 of Australians who rely on social security benefits to survive. The fact that you can actually still assemble in some states, that you can actually open your mouth, that I can broadcast here on Community Radio 3CR. There is something as a community radio network around the country, over 200 community radio stations, is related to people pushing and struggling for change. That's what it's related to. Nothing is given to you by the 1% that own the means of production, distribution, exchange and communication, and the 8% who make their fortunes through the fact they've got disposable income which they're actually able to invest in investment, taxation-friendly investment options, which a minuscule minority of the population, less than 10%, is able to enjoy. So think about it. It came through struggle. We may have forgotten the names of the people involved. We may have forgotten about their struggle, what they did, the sacrifices they made. But what we enjoy today, what governments, especially the opposition in this country, wants to take away from us is totally related to us being spectators. That's right, spectators at our own funeral, you know? And that's the key. Democracy isn't rule of the people, by the people, for the people. Democracy is rule of the people, by the people, for the people, by an engaged public. And that's the key, an engaged public. And if our sights are set out in other places because of, you know, the type of garbage that we have to put up with every day, well then they do what they like. As I keep saying, cynicism, defeatism is the aphrodisiac of this country's ruling classes. Now, I never knew that the Prime Minister in waiting, Mr. Dutton, was a wizard. I never knew he was a wizard. I knew he's a lot of things, but not a wizard. Now, I was a little bit surprised. I won't use the word shocked. I think I'm beyond shock these days. You know, when you've got a convicted felon, a buffoon as President of the United States, well, you move beyond shock and all. But I was amazed that Peter Dutton is a wizard. You know, he's got a cape, a little hat to cover his bald patch, well, his bald head. The lad's a wizard. And why is a wizard? Because while being interviewed, I should say, being chatted up by the corporate-owned media, and the key word is chatted up, he never gets interviewed by the corporate-owned media. Maybe a few questions are asked by the Australian Broadcasting Corporation, but he never seems to appear on the Australian Broadcasting Corporation. The fact is that the lad transformed, in one word, he transformed the Australian Greens into neo-Nazis. He used the same words in the same sentence, equating the political platform of the Australian Greens as similar to the platform of this country's minuscule, marginalised neo-Nazis. As if to say neither, he said neither had any place in Australian society, although the Australian Greens have members in the Federal Parliament, in the Legislative Council, in the Senate, and they have members in most states and territories in this country. So they're unacceptable, beyond the pale. So what he's done, and why he's a wizard, I'll tell you why. What's happened is he's transformed the fairies at the bottom of the garden into swastika-raving neo-Nazis. The man's a magician. He's a wizard. Pretty hard thing to do. Almost as hard as turning lead into gold. The lad's finally been able to use that line, and I'm thought, wow. And what was the media response? What was the response of the corporate-owned media? They bowed before the wizard as he transformed the fairies at the bottom of the garden. This is what the Greens was called when they first started, into neo-Nazis. And why has he done that? Because he's concerned. He is concerned. Initially, when the Australian Greens were formed, and I'm not a member of the Australian Greens, don't get me wrong, all right. Initially, when they were formed, they were derided as being irrelevant, fairies at the bottom of the garden. Now that they're beginning to, show a little bit of political muscle, gain around 15 to 16, sometimes 17% of the national vote at federal elections, they've become a threat. Because their legislative agenda could imperil the lads and lasses that Mr. Dutton and the moribund Liberal National Party represent in this country. So, Pierre, congratulations on becoming a wizard. There's only one problem, mate. sometimes wizards just disappear. They disappear up their own rear end. So there's always hope in life. All right, let's move on. Now, we tend to get caught up. I mean, when activists are powerless, we tend to get caught up in issue-orientated politics. I mean, there's nothing wrong with issue-orientated politics, but it's not the main game. Let's be realistic. Because we've got marriage equality, it does mean that, there are changes that are significant to some people, but they're changes which can be incorporated into a capitalist society, one based on private investment, private profit. Even if the voice referendum succeeded, easily incorporated into the structure of a capitalist society. If we change Invasion Day to another day, it can easily be incorporated into Australian society. And that's the issue. Sorry for the tautology. That's what happens with issue-orientated politics. But we need to go a little bit further as far as this federal election is concerned, because this federal election is supposedly about people doing it tough. And I love the way they like to bring out these, little statements, doing it tough. We see the wizard, Pierre Dutton, waving his stick, turning the Australian Greens into neo-Nazis, telling his fellow Australians, my fellow Australians, your fellow Australians, how bad he feels and his party feels about the plight we find ourselves in. All right? So, what is entrenched privilege? Economic injustice equals entrenched privilege. It's very simple. You can make all the issue-orientated suggestions you like. But the fact is that much of the hatred that exists in our community, which is manipulated by people who exercise power in this country through their little, puppets, a lot of that hatred is based on the fact of economic injustice. I don't even like using the word economic injustice. How about economic exploitation equals entrenched privilege? And these people have the capacity to not only influence but determine parliamentary legislation. And that's why the wizard, Pierre Dutton, transformed the fairies at the bottom of the garden into neo-Nazis, because they may have policies which would impinge on the bottom line of his mates. Yep, think about it. So, entrenched privilege comes from economic exploitation. And if we as activists don't get involved in that main game, the inequalities which have sprung up in our society, which are exploited by those who exercise power for their own personal interests, if we don't tackle this issue head on, we are irrelevant. Irrelevant. Standing on the sidelines going, oh, Ronnie, that's not nice. Oh, that's not cricket. So, federal election before, I think, May the 15th or the 13th, possibly in April, maybe even in March. So what am I interested in? What should you think about? I mean, obviously you're interested in your own business, but what should you think about? All right, I'll go through this again, because these are the things I think we need to be able to use a crowbar. Now, remember the old-fashioned crowbar? To actually disengage the bulk of the population from the transformation of people who are oppressed into people oppressing other people who are oppressed. And that's what this election is about. It's about hate and division. To see the wizard, Peter Dutton, even politicise the 80th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz by Soviet soldiers is sickening. This is a party that will use everything at their disposal to generate hate in our community. And this election is an election which will not be based on economic policies, but will be based on stirring hate and division in our community. Well, the Australian community. So what am I interested in? Things you may be interested in. A universal basic income. The antidote to the jobs lost through the implementation of artificial intelligence. The implementation of artificial intelligence isn't just about doing things faster. It's about removing the most expensive component in the private investment for private profit, mantra, and that's wages for workers. So what do we do with people who capitalist society doesn't need? So that's the idea of a universal basic income, to ensure that every person has the ability to satisfy their basic human needs without needing to stand on the margins and beg for the crumbs which are brushed off the corporate table. And as they fall, we fight amongst ourselves for these crumbs, because of our gender, sexual orientation, culture, language we speak, religion, race, and the list goes on and on. We can always find reasons to fight each other and not look at the reason that we find ourselves in this situation in the world's richest sovereign nation state. So I'm interested in a universal basic income as a major political focus during this federal election. Now, what I'm interested in and what will occur because of the domination of social media and the legacy media by the 1% that owns the means of production, distribution, exchange and communication are two different things. But that doesn't mean that you and I shouldn't talk about and discuss and attempt to implement and struggle for ideas which improve the lives of people. Things like a universal basic income. So we don't have to rely on private charities to send Australian kids to public schools. Now, you know about the goods and services tax. It's a wonderful tax, isn't it? Because it really hits those with the least income the most. I mean, if you earn a few million a year, a goods and services tax isn't a big imposition. But if you rely on a social security benefit to survive, a goods and services tax can be a major imposition. To lose 10% of your income, or say even 5% of your income, when that income is limited to look after the basic necessities of life, is a big issue. So when they introduced a goods and services, remember, goods and services tax, why didn't they introduce a financial transaction tax? Something I'm interested in as far as this federal election is concerned, which most likely you won't hear about, is a 1% financial tax on transactions over $5,000. You can exclude first home buyers. You can make a few exclusions like we did for the goods and services tax regarding, food. Think about it. Think about the billions of dollars of money which would pour into the federal treasury. And these days, when everything is digitalised and computerised, it's a simple tax to implement. And how about a 1% stock market turnover tax every time a share is bought or sold? Not just in Australia. You could raise at least $40 billion a year, but even, spread the net a bit further in terms of Australian citizens buying, stocks and shares overseas in other stock markets. And what will we do with all this money? Talking about maybe $100 billion, maybe 150. What will we do with all this money? Well, I know this sounds a bit radical, but we could use it to improve the lives of millions of Australians. We could use it to help finance a universal basic income. We could use it to bolster revenue for public health, public education, public housing, public infrastructure, and maybe the National Disability Insurance Scheme. Extraordinary. How radical. Using money by, taxing people who've got an excess of money to look after the interests of the population as a whole. Extraordinary. We don't want that. I'm sure the wizard, pointy head, doesn't want that. How about, now, how do you feel about tying your defence options to a buffoon? Yeah? The buffoon, the current president of the US of A. The trouble with jokes is they become elected. So shouldn't we drastically reduce our defence ties with the failing USA empire and strengthen defence tie with our Asian neighbours? We do live in Asia. We don't live on the east coast or the west coast of the US of A. And as I keep saying, I haven't seen a tugboat strong enough to drag little old Australia to the west coast of California. So do you really want this country and your children and your grandchildren to be sacrificed on the altar of United States foreign policy? We want Greenland. We want the Panama Canal. We want this. We want that. Think about it. Isn't it about something else I'm interested in, which is not economic, but it will be economic eventually? Shouldn't we reboot the failing reconciliation process by beginning negotiations with this country's First Nations people, both Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders? You think after 235 years, and after how we've seen our New Zealand neighbours, tackle the issue, that we, as a nation, would be able to tackle this issue? Now, something which I'm sure will send shivers up the back, not only of the Liberal Party and the National Party and the Australian Labor Party, but all decent-minded people in this country. Yep, the whole six of you, decent-minded people. Remember, Australia is basically, a land for mugs. Pay your taxes, obey the laws, do the right thing, and guess what? When you retire, you pay for your own retirement costs. That's what superannuation is about. And if you worked hard all your life in, poorly paid jobs, or you had to take time off, well, guess what? Your retirement is stuffed because you haven't got enough money to be invested to look after your future. But that's a different story. Now, let's get back to this. Why don't we nationalise, I use the word nationalise, brackets, without compensation, end of brackets, all mineral resource corporations, both foreign owned and locally owned, with an annual turnover over $100 million. Why shouldn't the wealth of this country, especially the mineral wealth, be shared by all Australians, not just shareholders? Think of it. And if you're concerned about nationalising without compensation, well, what we could do is we could say, well, 90% taxation on profits. If you don't like it, piss off. And then you wouldn't raise any constitutional questions regarding the need to compensate people for having their property, in inverted commas, taken away. There's one thing I can't understand about living in this country is we have so many natural resources. Bauxite, good old uranium, which, the wizard Mr. Dutton wants to use to set up a nuclear power industry in this country. We won't even talk about that. Iron ore, coal, gas, diamonds, gold, bauxite, rare earth minerals, the list goes on and on. Sapphires, opals, who knows? Why shouldn't the wealth of the Commonwealth, remember it's the Commonwealth of Australia, be shared by all of us? Now, if you understand about capitalism, see the deregulation, I'm going to use the 4 words, sorry, it's a 4-letter word. The deregulation, privatisation, globalisation, corporatisation, tsunami which has swept over Australia, right, has meant that the private sector has got bigger and bigger and bigger. I'm not talking about small business, which is shrinking, but I'm talking about the corporations which dominate almost every aspect of our existence. Because there's no competition, because with the privatisation of public assets, there's no competition between the public and private sector. No wonder real estate prices have skyrocketed, because there's no competition from the public housing sector, because governments have, said, well, we'll support the private sector to provide much needed housing. It doesn't work that way, does it, as you and I know? So what we need to create a third tier to the Australian economy. Not just private and public, but a cooperative, collective tier. Now, if you want to start up a cooperative and collective in this country, you're not going to get rich, but at least you're going to be able to provide goods and services at a reasonable price to the community and get a reasonable return for your labour. But nobody's going to give you any money to start up your business. If you're a private company and they think they're going to make a buck, they're going to pour money at you, but you're not going to make a buck out of cooperative or collective. But you will look after the needs of people. So I'm suggesting, just suggesting. What I suggest doesn't really matter, does it? But again, we need to open up the scope of the debate surrounding this so-called federal election. We'll be asked to make a choice, not in terms of the economy, not in terms of the culture war, but in terms of 2 so-called leaders. So, can't we use 1% of Australia's superannuation contributions to provide seeding funding for cooperatives and collectives? And if you are worried about your money being in a privately owned bank, which could go bankrupt, you could lose everything tomorrow. It does happen. Historically, it has happened. Isn't it time to create a new people's bank? Isn't it time to create a financial institution which is owned by the federal government, which is incorporated in the Australian Constitution? So no future government could sell it on ideological whim. I'm quite certain that the tsunami of privatisations which occurred in the 80s and 90s and even now continuing now would never have occurred if these institutions, which were owned and financed by the Australian people, if their ownership had been incorporated in the Australian Constitution, because you'd need a referendum to sell them off. And I don't think they would be successful. So, if you're not interested in the next federal election, fine. But if you are, and I am, let's talk about economic exploitation, the entrenched privilege this confers on a shrinking minority in this country, and things we can do or suggest and push for to change the equation. So we no longer have to rely on the crumbs brushed off the corporate table, because we'll saw one leg of the corporate table and there will be crumbs for everyone. Maybe even a cake or two. Listen to The Anarchist World this week, broadcast across Australia by the Community Radio Network. My name's Joseph Toscano. I'm hosting today's program. If you want to learn more about anarchism or public interest before corporate interests, or myself, or the ideas which are incorporated in this program, plenty of things on the website. YouTube, public interest before corporate interests. YouTube, josephtoscano.com. Facebook, Joseph Toscano. Facebook, public housing, everybody's business. Defend and extend public housing. And the list goes on and on and on. It's not a matter of material out there. It's a matter of people taking their future seriously and taking it out of the hands of those who continue to make decisions on our behalf for their benefit. Listen to The Anarchist World this week, broadcast across Australia via the Community Radio Network, and you can always leave messages on 0439 395 489. Now, I didn't know the Buffoon, the president of the USA, was such a fan of Stalin. I never knew that. I thought the Buffoon was a little bit like Mussolini, lifting his hands up and carrying on. But I never knew he was a friend of Stalin, because I love the Buffoon's Gaza solution. I'm sure you love it too. Just get rid of them. Send them to Jordan. Send them to Egypt. And let's not forget that Jordan and Egypt are fundamentally economic vassal states of the USA. Let's not forget that. That many nations around the world are quite concerned about finding themselves on the wrong side of the USA, irrespective of whether the Buffoon is in charge or not. But the Buffoon said, why don't we just empty Gaza, Send them away. It's not a nice place. The place has been almost totally destroyed, so they need to go somewhere else. Now this was Stalin's favourite tactic. When he faced a dilemma or a revolt, or he believed, the paranoia, he believed there was a revolt imminent, what happened? He deported whole communities, millions of people, to different parts of the Soviet Empire. So I don't know if the Buffoon realises that he's, the suggestion he's made regarding the people of Gaza sits nicely in the Stalin Handbook of how to deal with troublesome minorities. Extraordinary. They've withstood 15 months of carnage, almost 50,000 people killed, mainly women and children, about 70%. Very few Hamas operatives in comparison to the number that still exist. And now we have the Buffoon telling us that we need to empty Gaza. I'm sure the lad will be spoken to by his people, and maybe he'll take it back. Who knows? Let's not forget that some bigwig from the USA is coming to have a look at Gaza for himself, and then he will chat to the buffoon about what should be done. And let's not forget, as we saw with Colombia, the United States of America has a lot of economic power and as well as military power, and countries can fold very quickly if economic and military power is used, threatened to be used against them, especially countries like Jordan and Egypt, which are dependent on United States foreign aid. Dependent. This is the Anarchist World this week, broadcast across Australia via the Community Radio Network. Deep Seek. Never heard of it until a few days ago. Deep Seek. Caused a bit of consternation in the world because while the US private sector, with the assistance of the federal government in the US of A, was spending billions of dollars trying to perfect and monopolise artificial intelligence, because it is the next big disruptor on the block. What happens? Some Chinese outfit develops Deep Seek, artificial intelligent, how shall I put it, platform almost for a fraction of the cost, and causes consternation in the USA financial system. Here we have, it's not just about Deep Seek, here we have a major threat to the view that Americans, especially those who exercise power, the buffoons' mates, have of themselves. American exceptionalism. We're going to go to Mars, we're going to do this, we're going to do that. This is the Gunner tribe, And all of a sudden, this little maverick outfit out of China produces the same stuff which could have a fundamental impact on the way we live on the planet for a fraction of the cost. American exceptionalism blown to the wind. Blown to the wind by this little maverick outfit. So, I just sort of talk about, and I've spoken about this before, about artificial intelligence. To me, artificial intelligence equals slavery. It's akin to slavery. Now, the British Empire rose and fell on the black back of slavery. The Roman Empire rose and fell on the back of slavery, because having slaves that you don't pay for their labour, free labour, gives you an advantage as far as accumulating wealth is concerned, as long as you've got a mechanism via which to control the slaves. And I'll go through this again. Now, artificial intelligence has got the same economic features as slavery. What will happen is, as we saw in the Roman Empire, the plebeians were pushed out of the equation with the introduction of wide-scale slavery. So you didn't need their labour for the Roman Empire to expand. You didn't need the bloody plebeians. They were just a waste of time. So that's why we got the bread and circuses type of analogy. Basic food, basic necessities were subsidised by the state, and entertainment was provided. I think it was 245 public holidays in the Roman calendar at its glory time. So we've got the same problem, right? Artificial intelligence will have major impacts on the way we earn our living. And when you start playing with the way people earn their living, you have the potential for revolt. Not just reform, but revolt and revolution. As we saw in Europe, with the decline of feudalism and the rise of industrialisation. Now, the digital economy has had some impact, but artificial intelligence will put that impact on individuals on steroids. And that's why I keep saying that we've reached a stage, especially in Western history, that we need to be able to create an economic system which ensures that all citizens and residents have the basic necessities of life and don't need to be involved in the wage system. And that's what DeepSeek has done. It has said for a fraction of the cost, the monopolies, the private monopolies in the USA have had over the creation of artificial intelligence platforms, that for a fraction of the cost, we can create the same platforms. Maybe with a little bit of censorship, not as efficient, but it's the same concept for a fraction of the cost. So as artificial intelligence becomes more and more incorporated into our economy, the greater the need for a universal basic income. And that's why I'm suggesting, and I'm just one individual, just suggesting that a universal basic income should be a pivotal campaign issue at the forthcoming federal election. So DeepSeek, a dagger in the heart of American exceptionalism. Maybe it was just a myth to begin with. Who knows? Australian exceptionalism, American exceptionalism, Indian exceptionalism, Well, maybe it's all a myth. Maybe we're all just human beings. Who knows? Now, my fellow Australians, remember what used to, or as Gough Whitlam used to say, men and women of Australia. Now, I feel, my fellow Australian, men and women of Australia, I feel sick in the guts. I feel sick in the stomach. Why do I feel sick in the stomach? Did I eat too much breakfast? Did I eat horrible takeaway? No. I feel sick in the stomach because of the crap surrounding Invasion Day / Australia Day. Now, it's amazing that over 70% of the population, or maybe it's not amazing, still think that it's appropriate for this country's achievements and culture to be celebrated on the day that the colonisation process began, the 26th of January 1788. All right? Now, I'll give you an example, and I'll just leave you with this example if you're one of these people who thinks it's appropriate. Now, let's just say the Japanese imperial forces, and that's the word, the Japanese imperial forces under the Emperor, successfully invaded Australia in 1941-42, and they did cause havoc in Darwin and Broome and North Australia, Thursday Island, and the list goes on and on. So they successfully invaded Australia in, 80 years later? No, 82, 83 years later. We, the remnants, we celebrated Australia Day on the day the Japanese Imperial Forces invasion of Australia occurred. Would you be happy about that? Eh? If you were a descendant of the original colonisers, would you be happy about Australia Day being celebrated on the day that successful invasion occurred? Well, a few of you would, but most of you wouldn't. And it's the same with this country's First Nations people. Why are they any different? They think that celebrating this country on the day that invasion occurred as beyond the pale, as disrespectful, as a denial. Think about it. I keep saying to people, look at history. Put yourself in somebody else's shoes. This is not something new. Everybody says put yourself in somebody else's shoes, and then maybe you can understand. But no, we have the wizard, Peter Dutton, transforming the Australian Greens into neo-Nazis with a wave of a wand, now exploiting those potential divisions for his electoral gain. He knows that hate, H-A-T-E, hate and division is a wonderful rallying cry. He knows that. And Mr. Pescutto, the former leader of the Victorian Liberal Party, knows to his own personal detriment that pursuing ideas and policies which somehow give ordinary people some dignity and don't increase hatred and division in the community is a political death sentence, as he found out when he was voted out as Liberal leader by the hate mongers in the Victorian Liberal Party. A party that thinks that it will, because of the Labor Party's failure to address anything of any substance in Victoria, that they will be the next rulers of the Victorians. Extraordinary, isn't it? Hate is great in terms of garnering votes. It's a little bit more difficult putting forward some policies and ideas which actually unite us and help to solve some of the so-called insoluble problems we have as a community. Now, remember the good old days, the days of the Yellow Peril, the big map of Southeast Asia and the Yellow Peril racing through Vietnam, and the fact that, we sacrificed Australians to prevent the Yellow Peril racing through Vietnam. Guess what is one of the most sought after, relatively cheap tourist destinations for most Australians? I'm not talking about Bali, I'm talking about Vietnam. The enemy of 50 years ago is now a bosom buddy. Extraordinary. But that's what happens. People go to war with so-called, implacable enemies, and at the end of the day, those who exercise power, those who gain wealth continue to profit at the expense of everybody else. So going back to poor Mr. Pescutto, right? He sacrificed on Dutton's altar. The wizard who can, with the flick of a wand, I don't know what wizards, I don't think wizards have wands, I think witches have wands, I don't know what wizards have. I'm sure somebody will educate me in the next few days. Flick of a wand transforms an Australian political movement which is supported by about 15% of the population, significant minority, into neo-Nazis. Flick, 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 flick. Right? But we need more than that. We need to kick people. Right? We need to kick people. We need to politicise even the 80th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz. I mean, the wizard, Dutton, is happy to wave his little wand, change reality to suit his own short-term, political, ideological, personal fantasies. And they are fantasies. Because when you stir the pot and you create hatred and division in the community, whether you're elected or not, that hatred and division continues to exist, as we see in the good old US of A, where hate and fear was a fundamental pathway to election victory. So the wizard waves his magic wand, and guess what it lands on? The Aboriginal Islander can. Since before Federation, marginalising, pushing around Indigenous Australians has been the gateway to political fame. So he looks around, he says, what can I do to actually help my political fortune? What hateful message can I put across to the Australian population? What dog whistling can the Liberal Party and the National Party, get involved in? How can we generate fear in the community? How can we generate fear of the other? And that's what this election campaign will be about, the federal election. It will be not about facts. It won't be about figures. It won't be about economic reform. Obviously, they'll use the same crap, Everybody's doing it tough, battling, whatever they use, the words they use. And they're quite happy to manipulate the reasons why we find ourselves in this position, possibly their policies. This is the robo-debt brigade. Don't forget that. And here we are on the edge of a precipice, stirring hatred, kicking the Indigenous can, increasing division, equating the Australian Greens with neo-Nazis by the flick of a wand. And what do we have? Social media platforms jumping up and down, telling us how wonderful it is that we're finally, fighting back, against this struggle for equality. It's an extraordinary situation to find yourself in. If somebody told me 50 years ago, and I'm over 70, that I would be fighting these battles and the people around me would be fighting these battles, in 2025, I would have laughed at them. But the reality is, as I said at the beginning of the program, economic exploitation equals entrenched privilege. And if you can mask that economic exploitation by encouraging and promoting hatred of the other in the community, you can, as we saw from Mr. Abbott's campaign, find yourself as leader of Australia, or Prime Minister, the puppet leader, not the real leader, but the puppet leader of Australia. And this is the dilemma that we face. And for us to be sidelined because we think that issue-orientated politics and the culture wars are should be the primary focus of our attention, is the highway to oblivion. So don't forget, as far as the next federal election is concerned, economic exploitation equals entrenched privilege. And entrenched privilege will do everything at its power to actually increase hatred and division in this community. Thank you for listening to The Anarchist World This Week, broadcast across Australia by the Community Radio Network. You can leave pleasant messages or unpleasant messages on 0439 395 489. You can email me at info@pibci.net. You can join public interest before corporate interest today. Go to pibci.net. You can join online, or you can ring and ask for some application forms. YouTube channels, public interest before corporate interest, josephtoscano.nam. Web pages, as I said, pibci.net. You can go to anarchistmedia.org, another web page. What else? YouTube, platform. Oh, you can actually write to me. Yes, unbelievable. I do answer letters. I do know what a stamp looks like. Post Office Box 20, Parkville 3052. Post Office Box 20, Parkville 3052. Think about what's happening. Think about getting out of your armchair. Think about moving away from the computer. Thank you for listening to The Anarchist World This Week on your local community radio station, courtesy of the Community Radio Network. An analysis you'll never hear anywhere else. Anarchist World This Week, Australia's sacred cow slaughterhouse, 10 a.m. every Wednesday. Listen to The Anarchist World This Week for an up-to-date analysis of local, national and international events.
Poisoning their brainwashed minds. Oh, Lord, yeah.
Public transport's great.
What's not great is that unless you've got a radio with you, you can't listen to 3CR when you're on it.
Until now. The Community Radio Plus app lets you listen to us wherever you are.
Get on board and search Community Radio Plus wherever you get your apps.
Time's on my mind when I had you by my side. Am I thinking loud? Do I want you around?
You've been listening to a 3CR podcast produced in the studios of independent community radio station 3CR in Melbourne, Australia. For more information, go to allthews.3cr.org.au.